mention Absolom, that surprises me a little bit. I'm always in a dilemma when I'm in American novel. I teach two Faulkner novels that I'm probably not supposed to because they're not as serious, but after I send them through some really depressing stuff, I think some lighter Faulkner is good for them. But when I do Southern Lit, I make a decision about, always get into it about, am I going to do Light in August or Absolom, my two favorites. And I end up doing Absolom, which I am ready to say is probably my favorite one, except I chuckled when I was putting together my little passages from the works that I'm using. Faulkner's short story, A Rose for Emily, is a whole lot better to build your little citations around than this is because this skips around so much. You can't hold on. You'll see that when I start doing this. I had to put these page numbers to match up with my text. I'm not much of, I admire people who can do all this walking around. I have to have my notes. Now, I've had students say to me they're surprised that I actually had notes for my class, and they actually saw them. Well, it seemed more spontaneous to them. But I hope you enjoy this. I'm not quite sure how I came up with this theme of talking about Faulkner in the context of the hospitality state and a displaced person. And I hope you find out before too long. I read this in an obituary in the Arkansas Democrat Gazette not too long ago. I probably wouldn't have included this were I not working on this project at the time. This is what a portion of that obituary said. A true Southern lady. She was the epitome of grace and charm and a marvelous cook, baker, gardener, and painter. I would have liked to have helped them get those passages more parallel from a writing perspective, but then they're not. Whoever wrote this isn't in my advanced comp class. But that's what this said on here about a true Southern lady, and gave all those. Had I commenced research on Southern hospitality when I ran across this item, I'm not sure that I would have automatically thought about it in terms of Southern hospitality, but that's what that sounded like to me. And I want to begin by talking about the concept of hospitality. You know, that's one of those words that you feel stupid for getting up here and giving you a dictionary definition, but we all seem to know what these things are without knowing what they are. But this is what the American Heritage Dictionary says. You're saying, well, why aren't you citing Webster? Because the American Heritage Dictionary is better for getting into the United States language and culture. I keep several dictionaries handy. For one thing, I'm not a miserable speller. I am a miserable speller, and nobody said that you couldn't major in English and have to know how to spell really well. The American Heritage Dictionary defines the term hospitality as the act or practice of or a tendency toward being hospitable, an instance of being hospitable. And then it says, see hospitable. And my first inclination was to look up the root word first, and I said, I'm disappointed in the American Heritage Dictionary because I've seen them do a better job. The same source, now this is the way the American Heritage describes hospitable. A welcoming guest, as a welcoming guest with warmth and generosity, fond of entertaining, well disposed toward strangers. Now the second definition is having an open and charitable mind, receptive. And I think that's clearly the better definition as I want to look at it in this paper. The next thing I did was go to Google. Now, I know there are other research engines, but I still think Google can help you out a little more. Now, I didn't even pay any attention to this. Apparently, from what my students tell you, that the first thing you have on Google now, if you get ready to do a search engine, is that they automatically give you a list of AI topics to, and I said, well, I'm going to tell my students to stay away from that. And this is what Google has to say about this. I looked up Mississippi on this one. Mississippi is known as the hospitality state due to its reputation for warm, welcoming, and generous residents who readily offer assistance and friendship to visitors and newcomers. I do not know who wrote that. This reputation is rooted in the long tradition of Southern hospitality, characterized by a friendly and generous reception of guests. And we also know that Mississippi is called the Magnolia State. Now, this is what I found out about that. On Google, it says Mississippi, the hospitality state, also known as the Magnolia State. And then the website attributed to the Secretary of State's office uses both of the terms to describe Mississippi as the hospitality state and also known as the Magnolia State. A few people in this audience can help me with this, but I'm kind of sure that I first learned that Mississippi was the hospitality state in 6th grade Mississippi history. Now, we seem to learn a lot of more little nice facts like that about Mississippi in the 6th grade as opposed to what we had in the 9th grade Mississippi, which maybe dealt more with politics. Not that I remember that much, but it just seems to me that that was when, I always had that association that we were called the hospitality state. When I started looking for material on the hospitality state, or hospitality state, specifically Southern hospitality and Mississippi hospitality, the next place I went was Wikipedia, which I tell my students not to use that as their first place to go. But it depends on what you do with Wikipedia. The 3-page discussion on this subject concerned Southern hospitality and did not mention any associations to Mississippi. Wikipedia defines the term thusly: a phrase used in American English to describe a cultural stereotype of the Southern United States, with residents perceived. And I would ask you, look at that word. It didn't say known as. It said it was perceived. That's what if y'all want to know how I corrupt students, that's the way I do it. To show kindness, warmth, and welcoming to visitors to their homes or to the South in general. A pretty recent study entitled The Southern Hospitality Myth notes that the first this Southern hospitality first existed as a narrowly defined body of social practices among the antebellum planters. And the date that Wikipedia offers for seeing the characteristics of Southern hospitality was from 1835. Now, notice that book title is called The Southern Hospitality Myth. Now, if any of you are interested in pursuing some of this, I have two books that you might find interesting. One of them, both of them are from the 21st century, so you're going to have to take that into account. I can't decide whether I am taken with those. They're really good books. Let me put it that way. They're quite readable. Now, this is what a traveler to the South had to say on this subject. Now, this is where this book came up with 1835. Jacob Abbott said that the taverns in the South were poorly supported. Now, don't think of a tavern in this time as just some place to drink. It would be motelish type situation too. Poorly supported because the citizens themselves were so welcoming to the stranger among them. And as I explored this, several of these critics discussing Southern hospitality said that a lot of this is grounded in the biblical principles of how you treat the stranger among you. And that's where some of that comes from. And I will say that you could do a whole study on just Southern hospitality and get some good fruit, but that's not my intent here. In any searching that I did, and this included looking at two biographies of William Faulkner, I found no evidence that Faulkner ever really discussed the concept of Southern hospitality or Mississippi as a hospitality state. But I think he would have certainly been aware of that notation. And this is where some of this started growing into this paper. You're going to have several themes in Faulkner. I don't care what you read. This is what you want to look for. You've got the concept of the gentleman. You have the young boy growing to manhood. I can just list these off. One of the real ones, and this is one that I enjoy as much as anything, is being haunted by the past, of playing off the past and the present. If I had to point out one of the big themes in Faulkner to look for, it would be that juxtaposition of the past and the present. And then there's a sense of community. Now, that's just a few that I'm going to mention. And this is why I, in a moment of inspiration or perhaps foolishness, decided to come up with a map for you. Let me give you a little history on that map. When the portable Faulkner came out, and this was an anthology of Faulkner works. When it came out in 1946, now Faulkner with the portable Faulkner finally got financial security. But Malcolm Cowley, who edited or had a big part in editing it, asked Faulkner to draw a map of Yoknapatawpha County. And this is what he came up with. I have, and I wish I'd thought of this when I was closer to the office, I have that same map in a large picture. The last time, somebody a curator at Roanoke gave me that large rendering of this when I had a group of students at the Faulkner house. I do, and I haven't been in there a while, but if anybody wants a large copy of this, no telling what it costs now, but at that time it was like you can get a big poster of that picture for $10 at the University Museum gift shop. I don't have a stake in that. I'm just saying that I find that handy for pictures because now that is a little hard to read, but this was done in 1946, so obviously some of Faulkner's works are not included on there. But any of us who know enough about this geography can pick stuff out on here. Don't necessarily take it as fact because Faulkner played around with the geography a little bit of the area, but this does real well, and when students don't know the area. But this is what this idea of hospitality and sense of community in Faulkner's writing is what got me to this point. One of the other things that you may wonder about what have I done here is that I was inspired for the title using displaced person from a Flannery O'Connor short story entitled Displaced Person. Now, let me tell you, like a lot of Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor isn't exactly always just hilariously funny. It starts out that way, and then it takes a sharp turn. What I've always done when I mentioned a good man is hard to find is that I will not tell students what the end of that story is like. I'm just saying to them, you need to read it because you need it the first time to get the impact. I think A Rose for Emily, by the way, is a good bit the same way. But you have this concept of the displaced person. Now, Faulkner would not have known anything about this because A Rose for Emily was published in 1930. Absolom was published in 1936. This is what Flannery O'Connor was thinking about. In 1948, the United States passed the Displaced Person Act of 1948, and it was specifically designed to address the needs to it. And this is what it did. It was the admission of displaced persons from Europe, particularly those impacted by World War II, for permanent residence. It was the first significant legislation in American history to address refugees and their resettlements. It's 1948, and you have this sense of displaced persons. Well, think about what you've got at the end of World War II and why you had displaced people. Those people had lost everything in a lot of cases. I did a lot of thinking about this as the person who has the old family home of I would feel displaced if there were significant loss of that home place. May not be in the best shape as it could be, and it needs a good deep cleaning. I'll get around to that sometime. But I'm attached to that house, and I like old houses. And I thought about this with displaced persons. And what I'm going to do now in this paper is talk about the notion of what happens when you have this culture and this world that talks about welcoming people, opening your home, being friendly, being warm. what happens in the community. And the reason I gave you the map is to think about the closeness of community that Faulkner gives us in his writing. But what happens to some people in that environment of community? And I want to start out with a passage from To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, this is when the sheriff is talking to Atticus Finch about Bob Ewell's death and what happened there. Displaced person you have in there, at least in the mines. And I have to qualify this. I thought about this and I said, you need to qualify that a little bit. At least to the children in To Kill a Mockingbird, Boo Radley was a displaced person. Now, I think when you see the interaction with him in that closing scene of this novel, the community as a whole didn't displace him as much as the children may have. But then they weren't old enough to know any better. But this is what Heck Tate says. I never heard tell that it's against the law for a citizen to do his utmost to prevent a crime being committed, which is exactly what he did, he being Boo Radley. But maybe you will say it's my duty to tell the town all about it and not hush it up. Know what had happened then? All the ladies in Macomb, hospitality, including my wife, would be knocking on his door bringing angel food cakes. To my way of thinking, Mr. Finch, taking the one man who's done you and this town a great service and dragging him with his shy ways into the limelight, to me, that's a sin. Now, I would suggest to you that hospitality worked with that displaced person. But I want us to get into, I'm going to focus on Miss Emily from A Rose from Emily, and I apologize for something. I'm going to try to tone it down. I have to apologize for something. There's some things in A Rose for Emily. I'm not going to give away. If you've never read A Rose for Emily, I'm not going to give the ending away. That's one that you have to read the first time on your own to get the full impact. That's all I'm going to say about that. But I want to, there's some just really funny things in here, and I can't hold back my laughter a lot of times. But this is the way A Rose for Emily starts. Now, I'm doing Rose for Emily as Miss Emily is one of these displaced persons. What with the real life displaced persons is they didn't have property anymore. Every one of these people, the three that I'm going to focus on, had family and they had attachments to homes. You can decide for yourself at some point how successful they were, so to speak. This is the way A Rose for Emily starts. When Miss Emily Grierson died, our whole town went to her funeral. The men, through a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument. The women mostly out of curiosity to see the inside of the house, which no one save an old man servant, a combined gardener and cook, had seen in at least 10 years. Alive, Miss Emily had been a tradition, a duty, and a care. Now, doesn't that sound like these people are going to reach out with hospitality on this? This is another thing I love about Faulkner is that he'll give you one thing and then you say, now, wait a minute. we need to think about, it's like looking at the word perceived. We need to think about this a minute. A sort of hereditary obligation upon the town, dating from that day in 1894, when Colonel Sartorus, the mayor, who had fathered the edict that no Negro woman should appear on the streets without an apron, remitted her taxes. The dispensation dating from the death of her father into perpetuity. Not that Miss Emily would have accepted charity. Colonel Sartorus invented an involved tale to the effect that Miss Emily's father had loaned money to the town. This is how he explained that to her. Now look what happens in the community. When the next generation, with its more modern ideas, became mayors and aldermen, this arrangement created some little dissatisfaction. They kept sending Miss Emily bills for her taxes, and her response to them was, "I owe no taxes." This story is divided into sections. This is the end of section 1. This is one of these places that, if I had to emphasize something about this story, the transition between the sections is absolutely hilarious. But it said, this is what Miss Emily said. But Miss Emily, see Colonel Sartorus. Colonel Sartorus had been dead almost 10 years. I have no taxes in Jefferson. Told the Negro appeared. Show these gentlemen out. Now we move into the next section of this story. So she vanquished them, horse and foot, just as she had vanquished their fathers 30 years before about the smell. That was 2 years after her father's death and a short time after her sweetheart, the one we believed would marry her, had deserted her. You really have to read this whole thing to appreciate it. Now, this is what they do about it. They said, Judge Stevens says at one point, said, I can't go and tell that woman that it smells bad, that she smells bad. So this is the upshot of that. So the next night, after midnight, 4 men crossed Miss Emily's lawn and slunk about the house like burglars, sniffing along the base of the brickwork and at the cellar openings, while one of them performed a regular sewing motion with his hand out of a sack slung from his shoulder. They broke open the cellar door and sprinkled lime there and in all the outbuildings. As they recrossed the lawn, a window that had been dark was lighted, and Miss Emily sat there, the light behind her and her upright torso motionless as that of an idol. They crept quietly across the lawn and into the shadow of the locusts that lined the streets. After a week or two, the smell went away. That was when people had begun to feel really sorry for her. Now, I'm asking you to consider this in the context of hospitality and how we treat strangers amongst us. Miss Emily's not a stranger. As we move on through this story, they get a contract to pave the sidewalks. You know, the town's making progress. And a Yankee by the name of Homer Barron from outside comes in to work, and he and Miss Emily strike up a courtship. At first, we were glad that Miss Emily would have an interest because the ladies all said, of course, a Grierson would not think seriously of a Northerner, a day laborer. He was from St. Louis. Never mind. I'll just say that is really not the North. So really and truly, geographically anyway. But that's what the women said. But there were still others, older people, who said that even grief could not cause a real lady to forget noblesse oblige without calling it noblesse oblige. They just said, poor Emily. That's what we do, is we just say, poor Emily. And they said, like some of those other relatives that had gone crazy. Well, they worry about this enough, seeing Miss Emily and her suitor taking these rides in a carriage on Sunday afternoons, that they think it's bad. Then some of the ladies began to say that it was a disgrace to the town and a bad example for the young people. The men did not want to interfere. But at last, the ladies forced the Baptist minister, Miss Emily's people were Episcopal, to call upon her. This is another one of these that you just don't know the whole story here, but you want to. We can only speculate. The next Sunday, he would not, being the Baptist minister, would not divulge what happened during that interview. But he refused to go back again. Now, wouldn't you like to know a little more there? And this story gives you not one inkling of what may have transpired. We get the backstory about the taxes. We get this about the smell up to a point. There's never a confrontation, but now we have a confrontation and we do not know what happened. But they did contact their relatives that she had in Alabama. At first, nothing happened. Then we were sure that they were to be married. So, it's been scandalized. We learned that Miss Emily had been to the jeweler's and ordered a man's toilet set in silver with the letters HB on each piece. 2 days later, we learned that she bought a complete outfit of men's clothing, including a nightshirt. Now that's significant. And we said, you need to count up the number of times that we said is in here, they are married. We were really glad. We were glad because the 2 female cousins were even more Griersons than Miss Emily had ever been. We don't know that much about that situation either. But Homer leaves town for a while and then does come back. But they're still saying poor Miss Emily at this time. And as Miss Emily ages, this is what we find daily, monthly, yearly. We watch the Negro grow grayer and more stooped, going in and out with the market basket. Each December, we sent her a tax notice, which would be returned by the post office a week later, unclaimed. By the way, they even got mailboxes in town in the course of this story, and she never would let them put a mailbox on her house. Just add that as a note. Now and then we would see her in one of the downstairs windows. She had evidently shut up the top floor of the house like the carven torso of an idol in a niche, looking or not looking at us, we could never tell which. Thus she passed from generation to generation, dear, respectable, impervious, tranquil, and perverse. And as we found out at the end of the beginning of this story, she dies. The two female cousins came at once. And we know why they went to the funeral. They're more curious than anything else. They held the funeral on the second day with the town coming to look at Miss Emily beneath a mass of bought flowers. Talking of, and this is some of them, now these are the men in brushed Confederate uniforms on the porch of the lawn, talking of Miss Emily as if she had been a contemporary of theirs, believing that they had danced with her and courted her, perhaps, confusing time with its mathematical progression as the old do, to whom all the past is not a diminishing road, but instead a huge meadow which no winter ever touches, divided from them now by the narrow bottleneck of the most recent decade of years. And we're not going to talk about the rest of it because you need to find out the ending for yourself. It is funny. Well, some of you have read it. I can tell by the look on your faces. Now, I found out, as I said earlier, trying to do Absolom is a little harder than this one because the narrative doesn't go straight. I have to begin in this one on page 47 through Mr. Conson's voice. We hear basically the whole story, the whole of the novel. Now, you're going to have to go back and we have to piece this thing together from this. So, for the first 16 years of her life, she lived in that grim, tight little house with the father whom she hated without knowing it. That queer, silent man whose only companion and friend seems to have been his conscience, and the only thing he cared about was his reputation. That man who was later to nail himself in his attic and starve to death rather than look upon his native land in the throes of repelling an invading army. And the aunt who even 10 years later was still taking revenge for the fiasco at Ellen's wedding by striking at the town, the human race, through any and all of its creatures, brothers, nieces, nephew-in-law, herself and all, with the blind, irrational fear of a shedding snake who had taught Miss Rosa to look upon her sister as a woman who had vanished not only out of the family and the house, but out of life too, in the edifice like Bluebeard's, and there transmogrified into a mask looking back with the passive and hopeless grief upon the irrevocable world. I would submit, and I never had thought of saying this to my students before, but I would suggest to them that you get absolutely the whole novel in that one paragraph. Now, does that tell the whole story? Kinda, but not really. Now, let me make a comment. This is where people get irritated with William Faulkner. That portion of that paragraph I just read, began on the preceding page and winds up at the bottom of the page that I just read. And that's why I tell you, if you're reading Faulkner, you just have to keep reading. You can't stop. Now, this is a little more on Miss Rosa's Caulfield's plight. Now, Miss Rosa's life consisted of keeping it in herself and her father. Up to the night of the looting of the store, they had lived out of it. She would go to the store after dark with a basket and fetch back enough food to last for a day or two. Mr. Caulfield, when he moved to Jefferson, opened a store. So the stock, not renewed for some time before that, was considerably reduced. At one point, it says even the rats didn't have anything to do with the store anymore. They lived out of the store. They had nothing. I mean, Miss Rosa's in bad shape. I think what I'm having to ask myself as I go through these things is to say, did these displaced persons bring this situation on themselves, or do we need to look at the community? And what does it mean to be a community? Now, there was some trying that went off here. Now, this one's pitiful. And I only have a chance to highlight this. Thomas Sutpen, who arguably is the focus of this novel, I choose not to focus on him right now, needs to marry a woman of respectability because he's an outsider. And he makes a deal. Apparently money was exchanged for him to marry Miss Rosa's older sister, Ellen. And they have this aunt who's bitter, makes them do this big wedding. It was the wedding that caused tears, not marrying Sutpen. Whatever tears there were for that, granted there were tears, came later. It was not intended to be a big wedding. But the aunt wanted to have a big wedding. I'm not going to say one thing. Now, this is a marriage that, now you want to talk about pitiful. Now, this is a marriage when they get this thing. You have to go back and forth to get the sense of it. When they were married, and that's Thomas Sutpen and Ellen Caulfield, there were just 10 people in the church, including the wedding party. Of the 100 who had been invited, though they emerged from the church, it was nice. Sutpen had brought in half a dozen of his wild Negroes to wait at the door with burning pine knots. The rest of the 100 were there in persons of boys and youths and men from the Drover's Tavern on the edge of town, stock traders and hostlers and such as had not been invited. They invite 100 people to this socially prominent wedding, and nobody shows up. Well, 10 people, and that was the wedding party primarily. Sutpen and Ellen had 2 children, a boy and a girl. We won't get into them too much, except to say this. Both the niece and the nephew were older than Miss Rosa. She was an afterthought child, and the children were already in existence. Ellen was about 4 years older than Miss Rosa. The children were already there. and they have a bad situation, and we don't have time to go into that. I really don't think that has anything to do with this, except Rosa says to Quentin Compson, we've got to go out there and see what's happening. They've gotten word from one of the people that lived out there that there's been somebody killed. So they've got to go check on that. Well, by this time, Ellen is dead, and there's just virtually nobody left. Poor old Rosa Caulfield. You don't know what to do with her. And Rosa gets this 19-year-old neighbor of hers, Quentin Compson, to go with her out to Sutton, has to drive in a buggy 12 miles. And this is why she gets Quentin to go. He's a displaced person too. And this is what she says about why he needs to go. Because you are going away to attend college at Harvard, they tell me. His mother had sold property to get him to Harvard. So I don't imagine you will ever come back here and settle down as a country lawyer in a little town like Jefferson, since Northern people have already seen to it that there is little left in the South for a young man. And of course, that would have been the Civil War. So maybe you will enter the literary profession as so many Southern gentlemen and gentlewomen have too, are doing now, and make someday you will remember this and write about it. Now, Quentin is his own displaced person, and he does make it to Harvard, and he and his roommate Quentin tells his roommate Shreve about all this business with Miss Rosa. And they start trying to work out the ins and outs. You know, we said on this, we don't know what went on with the preacher when he went to see Miss Emily. There's some gaps in this text too. And at one point, and this is one of my favorite things in here, this is where that past and present start bleeding together. One of my favorite things in there is when this outsider, Shreve, who's from Canada, says to his roommate, Quentin Compson, well, maybe it was like this. And what they obviously start manufacturing a story to fit a really complicated family situation that involves interracial marriage and maybe incest. And they said, well, maybe it was like this. And at one point, Shreve says to Quentin, here's a little more about Miss Rosa. At one point, he referred to her as the old dame. And he said, do you mean to tell me you went through all of that and you're not even kin to her? Now, I want to bring up the end of this by asking the question, I'll let you figure that out, is how do we put Southern hospitality and Mississippi as a hospitality state in the context of these two women and Quentin who have struggled to find their place? What do you do with them? Do we just say, well, bless his heart, or bless her heart? How many times do we do that? And I'll tell you, this is a work in progress, and I haven't totally decided what I want to have. It's what I tell my students they've got to have in every paper they write, and that is a so what. You got all this stuff that you put together, and now you have to ask the question, so what? what does it all mean? Why is it important? Do any of you have any thoughts, or do you have any questions? Whenever I do something on Faulkner, I'm always afraid to say I'll be glad to entertain any questions. But that's what I have on these plights of these two displaced women particularly. And I always am so appreciative of the audiences that we have here, because in my mind, you people have to be some of the best audiences to speak to, because you know stuff. You know how to think. That's a joy. Yes.
Well, I have a question about Quentin's. There's a bridge somewhere that is famous for Quentin Thompson, but I've never been able to wrap my mind. What is that part of that story?
I'm giving away a big chunk of Quentin's history here. This novel ends in 1910, and Quentin is at, now I'm speculating a little here, and Quentin is in Cambridge, Massachusetts at Harvard, and in 1910 he commits suicide.
And that's the bridge that people go
through? Let me tell you why I think that it is that when I lived in Worcester, which is 40 miles 40 miles west of Boston, the directions they would give somebody to go to Boston/Harvard would be get on Route 9 and take a sharp left when you get to the Charles River. And there is a bridge that you cross at the Charles River, which is Harvard is right there on the Charles River.
And it has his name on it, correct?
That I haven't dabbled that much into that aspect of it.
I've heard it does. I've never been there, but I've been curious about that. It's kind of a pilgrimage spot.
Well, Quentin Compson. Compson. That gives me another little thing to think about. That Quentin was not happy in Harvard. Of course, he wasn't happy before he ever went there. So that's why I call these displaced people.
Well, who of Faulkner's characters are happy?
Well, see, this is where, if I had to suggest some, I would say it was these onlookers in A Rose for Emily when they're watching Miss Emily the way they are, and you have to bring up the basic point of, do they really care about her, or is she just an oddity? And this is why what made me start thinking about that is, where do we start defining community? What does it mean when we see somebody in distress? And, you'd say, well, now, look, now the town tried to do a little more with Miss Emily than they did with Rosa Caulfield.
They did put the lime out.
They did put the lime. And if you finish the story, you're going to find out what the smell was. And all I'll say about this, if you don't like one of these good Gothic terror horror stories, sometimes A Rose for Emily is not for you. I had, when I was teaching in Massachusetts, I was teaching a film class, and I had my class do a storyboard, and that's what they do, and have the dialogue and then the camera angles and all that. I had them do a storyboard of the last section of A Rose for Emily.
Well, let me point out that we have two pieces of artwork for A Rose for Emily. We have this one and the one over there by you, and I just want to take note that that one is painted in the artist's blood.
Oh.
Just another little wrinkle in that story.
You know,
It just gets weird.
that's what James Joyce said. If you're going to be a true artist, you have to give up everything for your art. I appreciate everything about this opportunity. The ones that always put the food out, I think about that is that Faulkner would approve of the kind of sandwiches that really and truly, he would approve of a chicken salad or pimento cheese sandwich.
It's got Southern hospitality.
That's Southern hospitality. That's exactly what it is. But it's always a joy to be here. And to see people from high school, although we have to think about and lament about the passage of time.
I suggest name tags.
Well, I'm not in charge of that. All I have to do is, but I hope this one is different than what I've done. I'll let you know how it comes out because I'm going to do some more with this.
Well, the somewhat of it, it just occurred to me that this part of the somewhat is what is community.
Well, that's exactly.
What is that?
And I'm not sure that Faulkner, he does and he doesn't. I'm not sure that he does us. And I don't fault him for that because goodness knows I enjoy what he does. I'm not sure he actually depicts what he sees as the ideal community. He talks about what communities become.
Which makes you think about what they should be.
What they should be.
I think
And-
they're showing what they're not.
Talking about where Faulkner and food's concerned, one of my favorite Faulkner stories is that, of course, he had by this time won the Nobel Prize. This was later in his career, and President and Mrs. Kennedy had one of these big state dinners to honor artists and they invited Faulkner to come, and his response was he declined the invitation because he said, "I'm old and that's too far to travel for supper." And that's my goal in life, is to get to that stage that I can turn down an invitation like that. It's too far to go for supper.
And then he leaves the set of the movie to go home, and he goes to Mississippi.
Well, that's what he asked. He asked Howard Hawks. That was one of the few producers he could work with because they were both they liked to drink. And Howard Hawks, who was one of the premier directors and producers when Faulkner was in Hollywood, he said, "Can I go home and work on this manuscript?" And they said, "Well, yes." And they couldn't find him. And he came back to Roanoke. That's where they found him, is that he did literally go home to work. His time in Hollywood blew hot and cold. He told Shelby Foote one time, said, "Hollywood's the only place that somebody will stab you in the back when you're climbing up a ladder." But it wasn't all unpleasant. Probably, and he was already doing Hollywood work when he wrote A Rose for Emily in the 30s. He did a good bit. In my estimation, probably of the Hollywood stuff he ever did was that he worked on The Big Sleep, the Raymond Chandler thing. Is that he was one of the people that did The Big Sleep. And that, to me, is one of his best. And then they filmed Intruder in the Dust, which he wrote 2 years after he did the script worked on the script for The Big Sleep, the good old detective story. They filmed Intruder in the Dust in Oxford. And Faulkner helped them find scenes around there. Huh?
They filmed the Reavers in my hometown, because
Then,
I watched a lot of that.
yeah. That's where they got a lot of houses.
They had a lot of role in that.
He just didn't have a good southern accent, did he?
Well, it's Intruder in the Dust and the Reavers of the Faulkner novels that I teach in American novel, for good or ill.
What other books do you teach besides Faulkner books?
In what?
Whatever. What other
I-
writers?
I'm teaching American novel this fall. And we'll start with James Fenimore Cooper, and people grimace about that. We do The Last of the Mohicans. And then we do The House of the Seven Gables. And one that you maybe haven't heard of is one called Ruth Hall by a minor writer by the name of Fanny Fern. She was more popular than Hawthorne and Melville ever thought about being. And then I do, supposed to do something different by William Dean Howells, but I do, supposed to do The Rise of Silas Lapham. I do a modern instance because I think it is, has a more contemporary flair to it. And then we do The House of Mirth, which everybody else would think I ought to teach, The Age of Innocence. But I like The House of Mirth. But that's the thing, that the joy that I have when I get to teach a class. I get to choose what I want to do. And then I do the two Faulkner novels. Oh, and I also do one by Harold Frederick, good old naturalistic thing called The Damnation of Theron Ware. Nobody, and y'all are saying, I've never heard of that. I want you to know, one of our people who just got her degree in English, she's in Alpha Chi Honor Society, probably our absolute best English major, they wrote a paper on the damnation of Theron Ware that she had written a paper for my class. And she did I told her, well, I didn't tell her what to submit for a scholarship application for a national scholarship. She won $3,000 for paper that she did in my class. The only thing I did there was to facilitate, saying, you need to apply if you've got graduate fellowship. So I teach strange stuff. That's one of my hallmarks.